Hi, everyone. Welcome to Creating a Safe Space in your Flute Studios with Paula Gudmundson, Katherine Lewis, Flor, Cruz, and the NFA Idea Committee. My name is B. Farrow, and I'm a volunteer with the National Flute Association. The NFA was founded in 1972 as a common ground for flutists to exchange ideas and inspiration. In the years since, it has grown to become one of the world's largest flute organizations, with members from all 50 states and countries across the globe. We invite all of you to become NFA members if you haven't already and take advantage of our year-round benefits, including a subscription to the Flutist Quarterly, borrowing privileges from our sheet music library, discounted instrument insurance, and more. Visit nfaonline.org to learn more and join today. We'd also like to acknowledge that today's online event is made possible with support from our members, our donors, and the Illinois Arts Council Agency. Thank you, and now I will hand it over to the panelist.
Hi, my name is Paula Gudmundson, and I'm chair of the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Committee for the National Flute Association. And we're really excited to host this event. We had proposed it for the fall, and there were so many great events, and so it got moved into January. So we're finishing up some of the virtual events from last fall. So we're really excited. Our committee, two of our other committee members, if you want to introduce yourselves. Don't be shy.
Hi, I'm Katherine Lewis. I go by Katie. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the accessibility representative for the Idea Committee for NFA. I'm so excited to be here. And most of you probably know who I am, but if you don't, I am a retired Army flutist and a proud disability advocate in the community at large.
Hi, I'm Flor Cruz. I go by Lisbeth or Liz. I use they, them pronouns. I am a flutist and I mainly do DEI work for national music organizations. I'm really excited to be here and get to talk to you about something that's so dear to me.
So when we were kind of brainstorming our committee, one of the things we wanted to do is kind of talk about how to create safe spaces for students in our studios and how best to do that. We're obviously we're bringing our own experiences into this space and sharing with you kind of things that have worked for us as teachers and maybe some experiences that we've had as students that could have been different. And we're hoping to kind of make the future of teaching and learning the flute really positive for everybody. So I'm going to kind of kick it off. When I was thinking about this this particular topic, one of the things that really stuck out to me and has really been kind of inspiring a lot of the work I do at the University of Minnesota Duluth, where I teach flute, but I also chair my department, is this idea of belonging. This is something that unintentionally became some of my own work and research and things like that when I went on sabbatical. And I had not a super positive experience where I was teaching, and I used that sabbatical time to kind of regroup and re-energize and kind of rediscover why I wanted to teach the flute and what I enjoyed about it. And one of the things that really has inspired me is this idea of belonging and how to create a sense of belonging in the studio, in my department, in the university, because that's really what will inspire a student to continue on this path in music, because they may not have anybody else that supports them or has had this experience in music. And so I in the, I think B was going to put in the chat, and we put together some resources, and the resource I shared was a book about belonging by Sebene Selassie. And I would just encourage you to check out anything kind of related to this idea of belonging. But that book in particular is written just from a perspective of like, what is it like to be in a space where you just don't feel like you belong as a person of color, as a Black Latina. You know, I find a lot of instances where the system is not really built for me. And I was never really struck by it. I consider myself very lucky that it really wasn't until I was in a tenure track position that I really kind of faced these challenges head on. But then I see after that, you know, chairing my department, how my colleagues can work to create a more inclusive environment. So some of these are kind of just 4 things that come to mind when I think about creating a sense of belonging in my studio. One of the things that I have that I really focus on is seeing students for their unique contributions. So I find that every student has their own interests and their own focus and their own sort of passions related to music. One of the challenges that I've seen is that sometimes we, as teachers, assume that our path is our student's path, instead of kind of looking at every student so individually and knowing that music may be a short stop in their life or it may be their entire life. We have no idea, but that we're here for whatever period of time, and that we see the things that they do, the things that they contribute in and out of music. So really kind of see them as a whole person. The second thing when I think about this idea of belonging is connecting to students. I don't try to come up with ways to connect with students, but inevitably I have lots of ways to connect with students. You know, they come into your studio, I ask them how they're doing. Oftentimes in an academic setting, they have a lot of pressures in their life. And I really do try to invite my students to tell me about all the parts of their life, the good and the bad, so that students feel connected and feel like there's somebody that they can talk to. A lot of times, and I'll just relate the same thing, you know, a lot of times my colleagues will say, I'm not a therapist, and true, we are not therapists. That connection that we can offer to students, that one-on-one connection, we have this really unique opportunity to work with students, possibly one-on-one, and that you may be the only person that they have the opportunity to talk to and connect with. And so really trying to connect with students personally with how they're doing in their day. This, I will say, has fundamentally changed my teaching in terms of, because I can see their struggles and I may or may not be able to identify with them, but oftentimes, you know, I can find a point of connection and see them and what they're dealing with. The third thing is, I think of as supporting students in their daily work and their career development. And so, like I said before, I try to ask students a lot about, hey, what do you want to do with this? Like, hey, there is this competition opportunity. Are you interested in it? Right? And so I present it to all my students, not just my best students. I try to give everybody, you know, even if I think, hey, maybe the student's not quite ready for this, in a few years, they might remember how this opportunity was mentioned before and they might be inspired by it. So I think, you know, mentioning to every student, hey, there's maybe a youth orchestra in the area. Hey, there's this flute day coming up. Just making all the opportunities available to everyone and making them feel like they could take advantage of that opportunity. And I think the last thing, and I've done this for a long time, is I am proud of my students' successes and their failures. Okay, I see a lot of opportunity to promote all of the work that our students do, whether it be in music or outside of music. So I think being proud of all of the things that our students do and really centering their work, what they value, is really, really, really important. So those are kind of some of the key components that I just wanted to talk about in terms of creating this sense of belonging. This is something that our committee actually talked about making one of the pillars of our name. Reflect this idea of creating belonging. And there are lots of examples. If you go online, I almost included it, but like Kansas University, for their music program, has belonging as sort of a central focus. And I think as we continue our work, it might become something that is a central focus. Our speaker for this Tuesday, Vanessa Rose from the American Composers Forum, talked about this idea of belonging. And that's something too, you know, that the NFA, we still continue to work on, or in our own programs, how to create a sense of belonging. I think there are lots of ways that we don't make music accessible to everybody, whether it's the music that we're studying or the types of concerts that we promote, the types of events that we sponsor, but you know, really creating an opportunity for everybody to see themselves in the space and in our field. So that's what I wanted to offer in terms of creating safe spaces, and I think we're going to move on to Katherine.
Thanks, Paula, for starting us off on such a great footing. In my experience, I am a disabled musician, and I wear that identity very openly and very proudly. When I acquired my disabilities later in life, and when I was really coming back into the industry and trying to find my place in the world of flute and the world of music and performing, I had this sense that other disabled musicians didn't exist, that there wasn't any representation of my identity in the community. And the longer I have spent doing this work and in teaching young musicians who may or may not have the criteria of what is considered to be a disability, I have realized that I was completely wrong, that there are flutists and musicians everywhere that may fit into the criteria of having a disability. But the reality is that where we are as an industry right now, many of your young flutists, your students, are probably not going to wear the label the same way that I do. They're not going to hold that identity dear to them the way that I do. But I realized that there was tremendous representation. In my studio, I began to identify the different types of learners that I had. The students who had a difficulty with reaching the keys, that their hands didn't work the way other students did, or the head joint, the way that they produced air was different than a student. And we don't think of these things as being part of the larger umbrella of disability, but it is part of accessibility. And so I try not to focus so much on whether or not a flutist holds a particular identity surrounding ability groups or not, because it's a really tough conversation for us to have as we grapple with what it means to be an able musician and what it means to be capable. But creating spaces where flutists feel comfortable, regardless of what experiences that they have, becomes the focus. And so there are a few points that I want to share that may help you make that more possible in your studios. The first being to adopt the idea of lifting barriers. When I changed this mindset for myself and for my students and the surrounding musicians in my peer group, even, the world opened up for me. Rather than viewing a student that's having a struggle with rhythm, or they're having a really difficult time with a certain technical passage, or their hands hurt when they're playing something, and they, no matter how many times you tell them to make this adjustment, it just doesn't click. Rather than seeing those things as problems to solve, I began to embody the idea that it was my responsibility to do what I could to lift barriers rather than to address things as something to solve. And I began to recognize in my students that they began to embody a curiosity that I had never witnessed before. And that's the second point that I want to bring. And they're really all kind of connected, is that when you begin to have the philosophy of lifting barriers in your studio, in the way that you teach, in the way that you explain, in the way that you approach different students, you're going to begin to see a level of curiosity in your students. I also not only want to encourage you to continue sharing that curiosity with your students, but embodying it and projecting it yourselves. Teaching from a standpoint of curiosity rather than what we're so used to of us feeling like we have to have all the answers. Not only did I recognize in myself that when I began to get curious about, okay, why is my student having trouble with intonation, even though we've made all the adjustments that I can possibly think of with my level of training? Why is my student struggling with, note recognition, even though when we separate the rhythm and the notes out, they can do it perfectly, but when we combine those things, why is that difficult? I began to recognize in my students the ability to lift their own barriers. We started asking questions. We started analyzing things from a different standpoint. Rather than it being a pinpoint of frustration, oh, I can't get this passage. Okay, let's look at it from a different standpoint. Let's get curious about what is going on in this passage. What's happening with our hands? What's happening with our body when we are beginning to play? Are we tensing up? Are we relaxed? Do we stop tapping our toe so we're not focusing on rhythm anymore? Putting those pieces of the puzzle together, laying them out on, I use this analogy with my students, putting the puzzle out, putting all those pieces separately, identifying them, analyzing them, and then putting them back together. It allows your students to avoid what we encounter so much with our students, which is a level of negative self-talk. When we approach the things that they may be struggling with or how their abilities may differ from another student, they start to compare themselves. That's how we have students that once were so in love with the flute and could not wait to go to band, say they don't want to do it anymore because they don't think that they can. And so curiosity and framing things from a standpoint of lifting barriers rather than having a problem to solve is the first thing that I would do in order to create a safe space for students who may be of different abilities. The next is teaching as if you are a learner. Your students know more about themselves than you do. Many of us are taught and feel as if we have to go into the studio space knowing everything. We have to have all the answers. We must know exactly every answer to every question that our student may have. But I noticed for myself that when I did that, I didn't offer an opportunity for my students to identify for me what was going on. And we were, I don't want to say we were wasting time, but we were losing precious opportunity for us to get to the root of what was going on, what they were struggling with, And Paula really hit the nail on the head when she was talking about having those conversations with our students. That is also part of this, that when we are willing to ask the question, rather than feeling the need to have the answer, your student will tell you. Ironically enough, having this shift for myself is actually how I learned that one of my students was dyslexic. We had spent months and months trying to figure out how to combine their phenomenal rhythm with their note recognition and then them putting it together. Because when my flutist would do rhythm exercises, it was fantastic. When they would do basic like warm-up exercises that we had memorized, they were able to do them without any difficulty. But when we put them together in a new piece of music, they could never really get those things to go together. And after months of trying to have all the right answers, of doing this and doing that and doing the metronome this way and doing the metronome that way, and analyzing all the different rhythm beats and where everything goes, and really honestly overdoing it, my student, in a moment of just brief silence, when I was completely overwhelmed, like many of us are, and we don't know what to do anymore, we're racking our brain, the student says, "The notes kind of get jumbled on the page for me. Why is that?" And everything clicked. And I realized that I had spent months not having the answer for my student because I didn't bother to let them tell me. I didn't bother to ask. And you might be wondering, well, what questions do I ask? This story is a prime example of you don't always necessarily need to ask a question. Simply having a moment of that, yes, sometimes uncomfortable silence, is an opportunity for our students to find and identify and give us the answer themselves. Just like Paula said, we're not therapists, but when we take the time to listen to our students, to allow them the opportunity to speak about their lived experience, which is really what all of this boils down to, is allowing our students to share their lived experience with us, we can find those solutions for them. We can give them the kind of musical experience that they deserve. I completely changed the way that I began teaching that student just because of that instant where I gave them the opportunity to speak rather than listen. So it became a frame shift for me, that the lesson experience, in order to be a safe space, is less of a traditional teacher-student dynamic than it is a collaborative process. Allowing the studio experience, allowing the lesson space, that hour of time that I have with my student a week, allowing that to be a conversation rather than me telling them A, B, C, D, E, this is what you're going to do. We're going to do it in this order, and this is how it works. Good luck. Have fun. Hope it works out between now and next week. Everything became a different thing for me. My students who were struggling flourished. Do we necessarily play concertos? Do we necessarily play the Mozart? No. But the music that they are able to play, that they are enjoying, and they are thriving in the way that makes sense for them. And finally, the last point that I want to make in creating safe spaces for your students of a variety of abilities is to give them autonomy. Give them the opportunity to be the role of the teacher. You would be surprised how much your students can do for themselves when you give them the tools to do it. And that may be giving them an adaptation to their flute so that their hands don't hurt when they play. That may be changing the way you do rhythm with identifying that they're a different type of learner. I have a couple of students who, rather than doing the click metronome, we do a tactile metronome because that's what works for them. That's the way their nervous system functions. So finding those unique ways together to lift those barriers through conversation is going to create that safe space for your students, regardless of what ability level they have. And I think that's my nice, pretty little bow of wrapping that all together. I'm sure that we'll have some time for questions after Flor does their section, but it's really a conversation, really opening up and allowing your students to be part of the process.
I want to share some slides from my demystifying DEI work in classical music. And you'll notice how we've all been speaking about some of the same ideals. And I think this works really great because we'll talk a little bit about intersectionalities, and then we'll go into an actionable plan. So talking about building accountable and brave spaces for yourself and for your students, I think what you really we have to get comfortable experiencing discomfort and accepting that, like Paula and Katherine were saying, we don't have all the answers. And it'll be uncomfortable because perhaps what your students are going through, you haven't gone through. But as we talk through this actionable plan and what Paul and Katherine have been saying, even though we have that discomfort and we know that we cannot solve the problems of the world, we do know that these ideals of colonization affect classical music, and not just classical music, music in general, just like they affect every part of our lives. So I want to talk a little bit about intersectionalities, specifically my intersectionalities. I'm a first generation student. I'm an immigrant. I grew up in the projects. We were on government assistance, but I knew that music was what was bringing my family together, as I was able to see how the trauma of immigration was pulling us apart. All of my instruments were bought on scholarship money, and they've all been previously owned. Till this day, my professional instruments are all previously owned. The only reason why I was able to afford them. And so your students perhaps will be going through some of these same experiences. And so what is some things that we can commit ourselves to removing from our pedagogy? Perfectionism. We know it's unobtainable and unrealistic, and it sets up our students for disappointment. Like Paula and Katherine were saying, we have to include all of who our students are. And perhaps going to our next point, perhaps that means that your student does not want to participate in competitions. Comparison, right? So their students tie their inherent value to what their output is, and especially in our structures, because we are always ranking them, right? We have chairs, we have placements, we have auditions. So they're already coming into a space that feels highly competitive, right? So taking those words away from your vocabulary or from your studio. And of course, what would it look like where all of our students' individualities and contributions were brought to the same table without the idea of comparison? So what that means to me is that the pool of knowledge would just be much greater and our students would be able to see and utilize the resources that every one of them brings to the table, instead of feeling that they have to conserve that knowledge. They don't want to help each other just because they're being constantly ranked. And then this scarcity deficit approach idea that the teacher has all the information and the student is a vessel waiting to be filled with all the information that the teacher has. Just like Paula and Katherine were saying, your student can sometimes teach you even more than you can teach them, right? So allowing that your studio to be a collaborative effort, just like Katherine was saying, you're not there to solve their problems. You're working together to figure out a better way for the student to get results. And this is the one that if you're going to take anything away, it's this on this one, because our work is so rooted in supremacy culture. We have to make intentional choices and on everyday decisions. So these are not just what you're going to do as a teacher. If you want to be an ally, you want to embody this in everyday decisions. What media are you consuming? What are you reading, right? And this is an ongoing work. So it's something that we have to commit ourselves to on a daily basis. So I want to talk a little bit more about specifically for first-gen students and low-income students. What changes, tangible changes, can you make to your studio now? So a lot of our etude books, the Tafanel and the Gobert, all the Moises, all of those are an IMSLP. So consider allowing your students to print those out, download them on their devices if they're using iPads for music now, instead of demanding that they buy physical copies. They can use that money to save up for a better instrument. Do you take your auditions? Do you pre-screenings? Do you allow video submissions? If you don't, can you talk to someone to see if using the dorms is a possibility during audition seasons? Application fees. Now, I know that us as flutists and studio teachers, we don't control that specifically, but maybe that's something you can bring to your staff meeting. Is there something that maybe either if you have a first generation resource center at your institution, could you talk to someone at admissions, see what you can do to advocate for your students? Now, this one's really important to me, concert attendance. In my master's, we had a lot of outside concerts that were required, which meant that we had to pay for tickets. So make sure that you have a balance of what the paid events are gonna be, because a lot of the times, depending on the students' individual situations, that is not a possibility, and a lot of our concert attendance is required. And if you don't meet certain things, they can affect your grades for your course. So just keep that in mind, how many of those concert attendance performances will require the student to pay, and is there a student ticket, and maybe does the studio have micro scholarships that they can offer so that you get to go to the impromptu Chicago Symphony Tour concerts happening nearby, right? Something that we can eliminate completely is this phrase of we all have the same 24 hours, because we don't. A student who has a full scholarship and whose parents are able to help them pay for their dorm or for their apartment does not have the same time as a student who is on scholarship but has to take work study or multiple part-time jobs to afford studying with you, they do not have the same time to practice as a student who doesn't have to go through that. So that's something that we can completely eliminate. And then, as mentioned slightly earlier, does your studio have its own money? Do you have fundraisers that your students could possibly tap in for all those competition fees, to register to be a member of NFA, to have all these extra resources? Do maybe Chicago is coming to the next town over? Can we pay for their gas? Some changes that we can do in terms of representation, program music and presenters of color of all times, parts of intersectionalities as a norm, not a feature. So we'll see it next month, and we'll see it in September, and we'll see it in June, right? Oh, it's Black History Month. Let's make all our posts about African Americans only in February. Is it Latin History Month? Oh, well, that's in September, so we don't need to worry about that till then. And oh, Pride is till June, so we have some time, right? We are not features. We exist. We have always existed. And Native Americans have always existed in this part of the country, of the world, right? So present it as a norm, include them throughout the season, not just as features. And if you can go a step further, commit to a specific percentage of events centered on performers and exalting the contributions of minority musicians every semester, every school year. Include works by purposefully excluded musicians every year in your audition requirements, in your standard rep lists. Allow your students to do their projects on any of their intersectionalities. There's a lot of times where I wanted to do projects on Latin American musicians, and they were always brought down. They were always rejected. And then once I was even asked if there was even a need to have a project like that. Take that as you will. And of course, in their recitals and hosting workshops and artists with degrees outside of performance degrees. Like Katherine and Paula were saying, we don't know how long their stop through flute or classical music is gonna be, but they're so motivated to get a music degree because music means something that deeply to them. So they can still be musicians while still being administrators, educators, owning a business, running a nonprofit, leading community ensembles, being music therapists. And of course, if you notice here, on some of these, I have the same recurring notice here. Learn how to pronounce ethnic names correctly. I cannot tell you how much this will mean to your student. Even if your student tells you that it's not a big deal, it is a big deal. There's a power dynamic where they might not want to make it a big deal to them. I go by my middle name, not only because my first name is always mispronounced, but the part of Mexico where I'm from, you go by your middle name. My family has never called me Flor. That changed was I got into college and I was being called Flor. Flor is not my name. My parents would not call me Flor. Right? And it's the same thing with names that are interchangeable in language. David is spelled the same exactly as David. Does your student want to be David? Or names that have translations. My brother his first name is Jose. Everyone calls him Joe. I don't know a Joe. I remember the first time that someone called the house asking for a Joe. We're like, oh, a Joe doesn't live here. Hung up. And that happened multiple times because we had no idea who Joe was, right? So don't automatically switch your student's name. If you can pronounce Tchaikovsky, you should have the confidence to be able to pronounce other names. Now, being an advocate, right? That's what we've been talking this whole time. Creating a safe environment for in your studio by being an advocate for your student and all of their intersectionalities. I've been talking or saying intersectionalities a lot. In the chat for the resources, on the one titled Additional Resources, there is a link to an intersectionalities wheel, and it explains what it is, and it has a little activity that you can do if you want to do it by yourself, or you can also do it in your studio. Of course, their cultures and their interests. If you have students from other cultures, especially indigenous cultures, chances are flute is a big part of their folkloric music. Maybe one day during studio class, your student can give the lesson and talk about their culture's music and how it relates to flutes or their interests. Maybe you have a music therapy student, or maybe you have a student that's really interested in a certain part of pedagogy. Have them give the lesson, right? This, again, it goes back to the collaborative effort that Paula and Katherine were talking about. Something really important, make sure that your minority students are participating and not being spoken over. Even if you call on them, I want you to notice if once you call on a minority student, to see if other students interrupt and jump in, because that's the case a lot. Just like Paul and Katherine were talking about, yes, we're not therapists, but ask how their classes are going and if those environments are conducive to their learning process, because maybe your studio is a safe space, but maybe it's the only safe space in this department, right? So maybe they're having a great time when they're with you, but when they go to their music history class, they're having a lot of racist experiences. Or when they go to an ensemble, maybe they have the conductor is asking questions they shouldn't. These are all experiences that happened to me, so I'm letting you know. Just because your studio is the best part of their day doesn't mean that the rest of the School of Music is helping their health. And again, the learning process is twofold. Know that your students are teaching you as much or even more as you're teaching them. Allowing the students to teach you or the studio about their culture and their music and their interests. Not only allows them to practice some of these pedagogical things we want them to do, but also brings forth that sense of belonging and brings forth their entirety of their being. I grew up in a border town, so I never noticed the disparities in classical music, because at the end of the day, I would go home and speak Spanish. All of my friends were speaking Spanish. We were all consuming media in Spanish. I left to the Midwest for graduate school, and that was the first time that I realized how racist classical music was, because that was the first time that I was completely immersed without having my identity reflected anywhere. So that's my part. Oh, wait. Oh, stop share. I think we have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. I had so many, I wanted to jump in on all of your things, but I'm just going to open it up to questions to people that are joining us. If you have questions, if you have thoughts, if any sort of dialogue we want to have. Yes, Dr. Cosette Lee.
Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm in Philadelphia. I'm a composer, and Dr. Gudmundson has performed my Rivers, an African tribute, on YouTube. And if you want to hear a beautiful performance, please go to YouTube and Google in Paula's station because it's excellent. But what I would like to ask all of you is, I know in today's time you have to be very, very careful. I was a public school teacher for 25 years, and you have to be very, very careful and sensitive to how you approach certain things with students who are underrepresented. For instance, I don't use the term minority anymore. I don't use indigenous. Because I found these to be oppressive terms. So you have to be very, very careful. So what I'd like to ask each one of your ladies, are there maybe 3 to 4 questions when you get a new flute student that you could ask a student to bring out, perhaps if you think you need to know something about their learning abilities, if they have dyslexia or something, and then also what about their culture? I taught in Puerto Rico for 3 years as a vocal music teacher. And so, but when you're in America, simply seeing a Hispanic person, you can't assume they're Mexican or you can't excuse, which is a different culture from Puerto Rico. So, are there certain questions you can ask a new flute student so that you don't have to wait 3 to 4 months down the road to find out something that's really important, that you need to know about the student as a flute teacher? And I have that question for each one of you, please, if you could answer that. Thank you.
That's
Well,
a really good.
oh,
Oh,
no,
sorry.
go, no, go, you go first, Catherine.
Okay. That's a really, really good question. And this is one that I get a lot, especially when finding out the best way for us, for us to approach teaching for a specific student. As part of my intake, several years ago, I began adopting a part of their first lesson is for us to kind of find out not necessarily what kind of learner are you, but a way of finding that through an activity. So during the first piece of music that we're going to look at, it's usually something simple. I incorporate a variety of different teaching methods. We learn a skill, visually, and then we do it tactily. And then I ask them, which one was the easiest way for you to learn? Which one made the most sense to you? So you're not giving them, just another questionnaire. It's really an activity for them to discover it themselves, while they're also learning something. So that's always part of my first lesson with my students, is to kind of discover the ways that they learn in a way that I can actually observe at the same time. That gives me a lot of information about the way that they operate, the way that they approach different types of skills, and the way that explaining things, the way that I can explain things better for them. I hope that kind of answers your question, at least from my standpoint.
Thank you.
I think I would say I'm not sure that there's like what, top 4 questions I would ask, but I really try to ask students about all of their life, right? Like where are they from? What do they do? Where do they go to school? What music do they like? So I try to get more like a whole picture of them, right? As someone who, is from a Latin American country, that's something that's real. I've found that students will tell you what's really important to them and what they want you to know. And even if you ask them sort of an off-the-wall question, what's important to them, they will tell you. And so I'm not sure if I have a particular question, but I would ask them about all parts of their life.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I like to wear my intersectionalities proudly, because if I am unapologetically myself, that allows my students to do the same. So when before I ask them a question, I give my answer. So let's say we're going through a passage and the student is struggling and we've tried a couple of things, and then I'll personalize myself in the problem. And for example, I'll be like, when I was working through this piece, this was difficult to me because of blah, 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 blah. Is it the same for you? Or when we're doing similar, I do an intake at the beginning, and then I'll tell them, well, this is who I am. I'm an immigrant. I grew up in Mexico. My family's from Mexico. I like doing these things. It's like, I like learning this way. You can give the information that you're asking of your student first to, one, make them comfortable and then with you, and then two, letting them know that those things that maybe they are not so confident about, you also have them.
So you're being vulnerable, right?
Okay, thank you.
That willingness to share it of yourself is really important.
And that's something too, I guess I'll go back is if they can see themselves, right? That you've had this problem, or that not this problem, but like you've had this experience, it can be really transformative for sure.
Yeah.
Lee, you had a question.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you guys so much. This is all so fantastic, and I love everything that you're saying. And it should go out to every flute teacher in the world. The same. What I want to ask you about is lots of every one of you has talked about methods that are actually similar to methods used in trauma recovery. And now that we are pretty well aware at the level of anxiety and trauma that many of our students have, whether it's from oppression or being left out or being on the margins, there's so many different ways that we make students not belong. How do you approach dealing with trauma, finding out whether what the students' experience of it is and how to help them? And do you talk about it at all? I'm just curious.
I do. I am very open with my students, and like Paula and Katherine was saying. To me, is because music is so inherent to who each person is. You're bringing so much of yourself and your soul into what you're doing. That whatever is happening in your other classes, whatever is happening in your family, any external stimuli is going to affect how you practice and produce music. So getting to those problems is the first step. And then the second step is knowing what resources are available to your students, especially for those of us that work in academia. Know what resource centers your school, university offers. Because like we've been saying, yes, I'm not a therapist, but I know that you can go to the counseling center and get free therapy. I know that you can go to student health and you can get evaluated. Yeah, I know that we have disability services that maybe you do need to get tested, or you do need to get the special commendations for test taking or whatever, right? It's also important to know what resources there are in your immediate university, but also in your community, right? What nonprofits are offering free help. Maybe they need help with rent. Maybe they need help with their finances. Like, what's the harvesters in your area? What's the United Care Services, because even though we may want to do everything for our students, we know that we can't, right? So it's also knowing your capacity, because music, everything of yourself is involved in your music making. First is getting your students to open up, letting you know what's going on. And then that second step in that actionable plan is, okay, what can we do, again, collaboratively, to make sure that the external stimuli are being taken care of.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just jump in. I mean, I've had the pleasure of teaching young students for a period of time, and college age students and adults. And I think the one, like Flor mentioned, music really taps into something that's really sort of significant, and allows people to express emotion. And that's kind of where this, a lot of times people, if it's interesting when talking to musicians, oftentimes they'll talk about a real negative experience that happened to them when they were studying music, and it really does come from a place like, maybe if it was, if they weren't doing something that was so personal, they may not have had that experience, because they were having to be vulnerable, because they were having to be in a place that they were being judged, right, in terms of playing music. It's like we need to have special care, because we can just deeply injure someone if we aren't careful, and if we aren't thoughtful about our feedback, or thoughtful about, I guess I'll put this out there. I remember as a kid being asked, like, are you going to get a new flute? Are you going to get a new flute? Are you going to get a new flute? And I'm so sensitive to that. Like, if I have a student that I know needs to upgrade, I don't ask them every week when they're going to get their new flute, right? Like, me as, a 12-year-old, I can't go buy one, so that's an example of, I've learned that you have to take care of people. This is something they're really passionate about, and they would get a new flute if they could go just charge it on their credit card. But, that's, so being sensitive to that. Katherine talked about kind of, I can't remember the word you used, but it was like, for example, I have a student, because I'm so sensitive about this flute shopping situation, that I have a relationship with a flute store. They can send them to me and he can try them. And I'm making that accessible to him, because otherwise, how would he know how it works, right? And then he was able, so there are these opportunities, and just being careful about, it can be damaging sometimes. Katherine, were you going to jump in?
I think, you asked the question. I do want to make note that you asked the question of, do you just ask these questions? And my approach is no, I don't typically. Yes, there are some situations where I do, but we have to build that trust first. We have to allow the student to feel comfortable enough with us that if and when we were to ask a question about their life or something that's going on that may be significantly impacting them, especially if it may be some sort of trauma, that they're not going to feel scared to talk to us and then unintentionally erode that trust. So it's really planting those seeds, having those conversations, asking about their life, as Paula does, and as many of us do, as she said, learning about them as a human being, helping to make them feel comfortable within that studio space, that if and when the time comes for those really difficult conversations, that you are going to be the person that they come to. And if you aren't, that you are able to feel confident finding them someone or somewhere where they do have that trust, that they can have that conversation with someone else.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you.
Rebecca, I think we have time for your question.
Yeah, and I'm if you don't, it's okay. I think I know how to find you all, but thank you. I mean, this is a wonderful, wonderful presentation, and just really like I love the care with which you your separate presentations, but all are individual, but yet combine really well into a whole. That's just great to hear. I have one comment, and then I do have a question. The comment is just on what Flor said about the application fees for universities. Is that my most recent student who is trying to go to graduate school next year, though it's going to be the following year, he just kept writing to schools asking them if they would waive them. And they mostly did. And it was he would either say, I don't have any money, or he would say, I'm Latino, and whatever worked with them at that moment, he tried both. And almost all of them agreed to waive his fee. So there are ways out there, and I think the universities are trying. So that's one thing I just wanted to throw out there. But my question was actually, Katherine, I love the way you talked about the idea of adopting your idea of lifting barriers rather than trying to solve problems. And that was really great way for me to think of it, because I think I do that, but also I'm definitely a solutions person, like in my normal life, like that's just the way I operate. So I'm curious if you have specific ways you've tried to do that, like any language or examples that might be helpful to help me be better.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm trying to think of a good example. Okay. I've had a couple of students who for whatever reason, I had a couple of younger students that had, their hands are very small and they needed like we tried a thumb port, right? And that's a solution, right? That's also lifting a barrier. The intention is to lift that barrier. Well, they weren't comfortable for them, and they didn't feel right. And so the rather than go to the next, okay, well, I have to, find this other thing to try, because there are several on the market, right? Rather than do that, I started asking questions. And this is where the tips that I gave start to combine, right? That the lifting the barriers and then teaching as a learner became one, where in order to lift the barrier for them, the barrier was that their hands hurt because their hands were small and they just wasn't working, right? The ergonomics weren't working. That was the problem, right? That was the barrier. Rather than going and buying all of these different things on the market that probably were going to feel the exact same to them, we had a conversation about it. What is it about the thumb port that isn't comfortable? What is not working? And that allowed me to then collaborate with them and find another solution. We ended up making something at home, right, that worked for them. Another one for me is when I have students, especially I have several students that are on the autism spectrum. Instead of approaching each lesson or each piece of music as a series of tasks for them, because tasks for a couple of them sometimes are a little bit overwhelming. Those tasks lists of like, I have 20 lines of music and they're all 16th notes and right? Instead of that, I approach it as, okay, what is the barrier to this? What is the barrier to you being overwhelmed? What is causing that overwhelm? Okay, so then my goal becomes lifting that overwhelm when they see the piece of music, rather than diving right in and going, okay, well, we have to figure it out because this is how we do music. So finding those, those barriers, those problems, and then having that conversation to find creative solutions instead of approaching things the same way every time. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Absolutely,
Just
thank you.
to piggyback off of that, I mean, I think the idea of lifting barriers, like when you see that a student is struggling or, and asking the question, like, okay, kind of investigative questions, like, okay, how much did you practice this week? Okay, what would it look like? So it is sort of, thinking creatively with them about what the barriers are and figuring out collaboratively what could change about that. I would also say, like, for me in a college setting, one of my struggles is sometimes I might not be the best person for them to brainstorm with. And so I pair my students up a lot. And so it allows them to create community, but it also takes the weight off of me. And then because we have a really big music education program, they're learning how to teach each other, and so for me, that, I mean, I can say in a college setting that works. Younger students, again, it's just about creating a team. You can also have the parent can be part of the team. Sometimes, I mean, my parents were not heavily involved, but sometimes there are parents that could be that other team member, and I mean, sometimes I wish somebody had asked my parents to be involved. I don't know, but anyway.
These are fantastic questions. There's so much to dig in on these subjects, and it's often feels for many of us like, creating a safe space is this really kind of like the boogeyman, right? It's like this ever complex situation because every student is so different, and yet this statement of creating a safe space seems so simple. And I think the advice overall for all of us is to be a human being and don't be afraid to just be human with your students. That I think it really boils down to that. That's how you're going to create these safe spaces where they feel comfortable being themselves and learning the way that makes sense for them, and being their wonderful intersectional selves with you if you're willing to also do this.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. I do want to shout out B, who is doing the hosting us. She introduced herself to us and she was like, I'm an amateur flutist and a software developer during the day. So I do want to shout her out. So thank you. Thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to any of us. I'll put my email in the chat. And like I said, you can find me. I'm the co-chair of this committee, but I'm always happy to answer any questions, or if you have any ideas, feel free to share them with me or any of us on the committee. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I know there's a big football game today, and we'll hope to see you all soon.